Welcome. I'm Professor MuqtedarKhan, and today I'm going to talk to you about the domestic sources of American foreign policy with special focus on think tanks and lobbies, and essentially identify what are the fundamental differences between a think tank and a lobby. This is part of our conversation about how American foreign policy is made. What is American foreign policy? How does it seek to achieve America's national interests? What are national interests? How they are defined? And then once we define national interests, then we develop strategies that we call American foreign policy to safeguard those national interests. And the strategies are then implemented by the State Department and the Department of Defense and other institutions like the CIA, etc. But today I want to essentially talk about how, when we define what is our foreign policy or what is our national interest, there are many sources which contribute to the shaping of our national interest and the shaping of our foreign policy. So I'm going to give you a broad picture first so that you have the broader context in your mind, and then we'll dive deeper into essentially the distinctions between a think tank and a lobby. So first of all, let's look at this this infographic that I generated that identifies the sources of American foreign policy. And if you notice that I divided into, like everybody else, most professors, most textbooks also divide them in a similar way as domestic sources and international sources. We can also try and sound more sophisticated and more academic and say agentic sources and structural sources in some way. So international sources are essentially the sources which are controlled, defined, and determined by the structure of international politics and the structure of power distribution that we call as world order or global order. And then the domestic sources are essentially characteristics of the state itself. So if we are defining foreign policy for America, then what is American identity? What are American values? What are American institutions? How are Americans at the moment concerned with? What are the things that they are afraid of? What are the things that they want to achieve? All of this become part of the agentic or domestic sources. So if you look at quickly, let's run an eye over these for international or sources. You have the structure of the international system, whether it's bipolar, multipolar, is it anarchic, or is it unipolar? That is one way in which we determine it'll help us in shaping our foreign policy once we have a system or we understand how power is distributed globally. We'd look at geography and geopolitics, who are our allies, who are our neighbors. So if you are, like, for example, as I keep pointing out, that if you look at China, China has 4 neighbors which have nuclear weapons: India, Pakistan, Russia, and North Korea. So there the geography clearly says that, well, right now they may be your friends, but you are in a very dangerous neighborhood. So geography also, to a great extent, determines how your foreign policy will evolve. There are treaties, international alliances. For example, American foreign policy these days is trying to shape NATO, for example. But NATO for a long time determined how America interacted with Europe, with Eastern Europe, and other parts of the world. So you have international law, international organizations, global economy, the supply chain. All of these are international sources that shape American foreign policy. At the domestic level, there are 2 ways in which you can look at it, those which are governmental and those which are societal. So at the domestic level, you have the executive branch, the president's values, the president's ideology, his party, all of that contribute to American foreign policy. The Congress also plays a very important role. I will have a separate video which looks at these 3 sources: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary. So the U.S. Supreme Court is also an important source of American foreign policy. So when I talk about the relationship between the American Constitution and American foreign policy, I will talk about how these 3 branches of government what are their powers and how do they impact the shaping of US foreign policy. Now come back to these four that you see in the bottom: public opinion and electoral politics, interest groups and lobbies, the media and information networks, political culture, ideology, and the idea of American exceptionalism. All of these contribute to American foreign policy also. So let's look at interest groups and lobbies. So I'm clubbing interest groups and lobbies as one source and also bringing in think tanks. So in this way, one way of thinking of think tanks and lobbies is to think of them as the Beltway bandits. The US government, the federal government, has a huge budget, billions of dollars. For example, the US defense budget alone is close to $1 trillion today. So there are companies, there are think tanks, there are all kinds of people inside the Beltway. The Beltway is 495 that encircles the US capital, Washington. So all of these companies, these agents, these operators who live within this are all trying very hard to identify some problem for the US government, for the US society that they can solve and take their share of the budget. So they're constantly trying to identify problems and then they bring solutions. And with that, they try to take money of the federal government. That's why they generally called as Beltway bandits. So in this map that you see, I have identified just a few think tanks, which are all marked in blue. And I've identified some lobbies, which are marked in red. So in the lobbies, you can see APAC, its address is 601 Pennsylvania Avenue. Then you have the Pharma Lobby, the American Petroleum Institute, that you have the manufacturing, North America Manufacturing Lobby, the US Chamber of Commerce, the National Rifle Association. These are all lobbies that seek to directly influence US government and essentially make sure that the laws passed by the Congress or the executive orders issued by the president or judgments passed by the Supreme Court are all in their interest and safeguard the interest of the constituency that these lobbies are representing. And then you have in blue a few think tanks that are listed. Heritage Foundation is a very influential conservative think tank. Brookings is claims to be center. I was a fellow and a senior fellow of Brookings Institution for 5 years. Brookings is considered one of the biggest and the most important think tanks in the world, literally. Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank in Washington. And then there is Peterson Institute for International Economics and the Atlantic Council. Atlantic Council is more or less like Brookings, a little bit on some issues, a little bit on the right of Brookings, on some issues, a little bit left of Brookings. It depends on the personnel. So these are think tanks and lobbies. I just wanted to give you an example. Think tanks and lobbies are also great careers for people who graduate with degrees in political science and international relations, in area studies. So if you're specializing in any of these fields, you can go work for the government, you can go and work for various federal agencies, you can become a diplomat, you can work in the corporate sector also. These days, geopolitics is an important aspect of global economy and global trade, or you can work for lobbies and think tanks. Think tanks and lobbies are like revolving doors. People who work for the lobbies go into government. People who serve in the government then go back into lobbies or into think tanks, depending on their personal orientations. So if you look at the think tanks, in the United States, there are an estimate of more than 2,200 think tanks all over the country. So this is an estimate by the Global Go-To Think Tank Index, which is produced by the University of Pennsylvania right here in Philadelphia. In Washington, D.C., their estimate is about 148. I think there are far more than that. Many think tanks are not fully registered. For example, Khanversations is also a registered think tank. It's a 501c3 organization, and I'm sure it will not show up on this list because all it does is help produce some of these videos that I host, and then it funds some of my research. Federal lobbying organizations, there are more than 15,768 lobbying organizations in the United States. And then there are nearly 4,000 of them that are focused on just the federal government. And then there are close to, literally they say anywhere between 500 to 2,000 foreign lobbying agents or lobbying groups that have clients which are foreign clients. So you will understand the distinction between the two as we go along, but just to give you an idea that there are so many institutions, that's why they're called Beltway bandits. They're all trying to influence US foreign policy, US domestic policy, US national interests, even US national identity. So it's an important part of, I don't think that the policymaking process in any other country is so complex and so diverse, and there's so much participation. Even foreign countries have a huge role. I was once giving a talk to a lot of spooks in Washington, D.C., and before you give a talk, you talk to the host and the director, and the estimate that I heard, and this was 4 to 5 years ago, is that perhaps there are more than 100,000 spies in Washington, D.C. alone. So there are at least 100,000 people in Washington, D.C. who are spying on the US government for foreign countries. So yes, Washington, D.C. is like a very busy place for politics, intrigue, lobbying, influence peddling, spying, etc. So let's focus now on think tanks and lobbies. So what is a think tank? So a think tank is primarily a research institution. It's organized to do research, to do policy analysis, to do reports on what policies have achieved, what policies need to be made, what are the directions in which the government should pursue, what is important, what is not, what needs to be prioritized. So essentially, they are developing position papers to advise government on various issues. And in order to do that, the think tankers are essentially experts who also produce expert commentary. So the primary purpose of think tanks is to produce knowledge. There are broadly two types of think tanks: those who stand alone and those who are part of universities. One good example is CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. CSIS is a big think tank in Washington, but for a long time it was part of my alma mater, Georgetown University. So it was part of Georgetown University, then it became very big, began to raise a lot of money, and so it became a spin-off, and now it has no relations or connection to Georgetown University. And the advantage of having think tanks in universities is that there are lots of experts in universities, professors, with a very low budget, you can have a large number of experts affiliated with your think tank if it's based inside a university. But the difference between a non-university think tank and a university think tank is the kind of knowledge they produce. Think tanks produce applicable knowledge, applied knowledge, especially policy-oriented. They analyze policy, they implement policy, they recommend policy. Whereas universities may not be interested in policy, they are interested in pure knowledge, theoretically speaking. So like, for example, you may, at a university, you may investigate new kinds of materials, right? So for example, you may find some debris from the space, which you have brought back to Earth, and the universities want to study what is the composition of this material. What do they tell us about humanity, about the creation of the universe, the history of the Milky Way? Where do they come from? All of those are pure scientific knowledge. Whereas some of it might go to a think tank like, say, MITRE or IDS, and they will say, oh, can we make a bomb with this that we can destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities? Can we make a weapon with this so that we can rescue the Hormuz Strait and things like that? So they are immediately into applied side of it. I'm giving you a caricaturized understand But you understand that knowledge that is produced in think tanks generally are designed to be applied into policy immediately. Otherwise, you will lose the interest of policymakers. Whereas knowledge that is produced in think tanks and research centers at universities are not compelled to necessarily focus on policymaking. What is the public posture of think tanks? Think tanks usually present themselves as independent or semi-independent. They are sources of expertise, even when they are ideological. Like, for example, we all know that Heritage is a right-wing organization. Center for American Progress is left. Cato is libertarian. We know that they have an ideological orientation, but yet they all pretend to be balanced, fair, non-ideological, etc. But they do produce useful knowledge. Sometimes your ideological orientation will determine what you focus on. So if you are a left of center think tank, you may worry about the impact of the war on Iran on working class people, on what's it doing to poor people. Other think tanks may not be interested in pursuing that, but that knowledge is useful even though it's produced by a left of center think tank. Whereas there might be others who think, well, how is it impacting the oil market and oil industry or something like that? So a think tank which is more right of center, maybe just focused on corporate profits, etc. Their methods of influence is essentially through policy papers. Think tanks influence policy indirectly through reports, through conferences, through media appearances, through giving expert testimony in the Senate, in the House, advising the president, and through networking, essentially. So the currency for influencing policy is knowledge, as far as think tanks. At least theoretically, that's what it's used to be. Now there are people who smooth around, who just go around, hanging out with politicians and taking them for parties or whatever. I don't think that is the job of think tank people. They are lobbyists, and that's how they should be treated. If you're not thinking, if you're only tanking, then you should be in a lobby. That's my position. After having spent most of my life, both in university, I've always been a professor in this country. I've never had any other job. I came to the US, studied, and from 2000 onwards, I've been professor for 5 years at Adrian College and for 21 years at the University of Delaware. But I've also been part of various think tanks. I was part of Brookings Institute for 5 years, and then with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding for, God knows, nearly 20 years, with Center for Global Policy for 3 years, then with New Lines Institute, with the Khaldun Institute, and now I am a non-resident senior fellow with the Middle East Policy Council. Now, Middle East Policy Council is an interesting think tank. It is like any other think tank, but it has slightly heavier academic component because it publishes a journal called Middle East Policy, which is a very influential and highly ranked academic journal, but which is focused on policy. So yes, think tanks can have depth when it comes to knowledge production. And if the depth in knowledge production begins to disappear and they become shallower and shallower, then they become more and more like lobbies. Think tanks claim to be transparent, and so we know where the money is coming from. So the core element of think tanks is knowledge production. Whereas lobbies, their core function is policy influence. The primary purpose of a lobby, which can be an organization, an interest group, or a for-profit legal firm, is to shape the government decisions to favor their clients. As simple as that. Now, a lobby could have a client which is, say, the milk industry or milk farmers. And so the job of that lobby is to make sure that the government doesn't pass laws that could increase the tax burden of milk farmers. They will try to see if they can get the government to give subsidies to the milk farmer, basically to improve the bottom line of their clients. That is the single most. They're not interested really in what is national interest. They don't give a damn about it. They're not interested in the global good. They're not trying to make the world safer or not. If they are, for example, if you're a lobbyist for weapons manufacturer, then you want those weapons to be sold. Like, look at NRA. You think NRA is interested in safety and security of American citizens? No. Then what will happen to all the guns that are sold? So it's like that. The lobbying has no moral purpose except profiting, and profiting only not at a national or societal level, but only at the level of the client. Lobbies, their public posture, for example, lobbies are more openly advocacy oriented and are expected to push a particular interest all the time. Their methods of influence can be decent, where they are also competing with think tankers in testimonies and trying to make the case as to why they. So, for example, if you are pro-tariff lobbyist, so you would be on the same testimony, Senate hearing or House hearing, where there's somebody from a think tank talking about the impact of tariffs on American economy, on American inflation. And then the lobbyists could come there and say, well, this brings jobs home, it increases manufacturing jobs, blah, blah, blah. So they're often walking on the same streets. They are always in the same room. But like I said, profit is the currency for lobbyists. Knowledge is the currency for think tankers. Is there a legal issue? Yes. Most think tanks tend to be 501c3, which are nonprofit. And because of that, they are primarily research and education analysis focused. They are allowed to do limited lobbying, but that is only when they are testifying to the government and giving their opinion. So, for example, you could be a lobby that studies the environment. And so you may have a preference for, say, solar cells over fossil fuel. So you could be advocating that the government spend more money on building solar cell factories or windmills rather than spending money on building refineries and finding oil. So that kind of limited lobbying is okay. You can't advocate for a specific candidate, for example. But whereas lobby, it can be a firm or an association, they directly seek to influence policy. They can advocate for an individual. They can even advocate for a foreign government, foreign country. So now for them, there's a special law called ARA, and it's called the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So if you are representing the interest of a foreign country, you should be required by law to register as a foreign agent, unless, of course, you're speaking for Israel, because laws do not apply to Israel in our country. They are above the law. For example, international law doesn't apply to Israel. For example, Netanyahu there's an arrest warrant for him by the International Criminal Court, but he keeps coming and going to the US, and the US does not arrest him. But if he went to Belgium or if he went to France or Germany, anywhere else in Europe, he'll immediately be arrested as a criminal and handed over to the international. So when it comes to Israel in the United States, none of this applies. Otherwise, AIPAC would have been registered as a foreign agent. But other than that, the law applies to everybody else. So if you're representing China, Russia, India, or anything else, you have to register as a foreign agent. And there are different restrictions to you. So, for example, recently we heard that India's conservative right-wing, pretty nasty movement called RSS hired lobbies in the US to try and improve their image. So those lobbies will now have to register as foreign agents. Some may cheat and pretend not to register as a foreign agent, but by law, they are required to register as a foreign agents. And so if American Department of Justice is doing its due diligence, whether it's a think tank or a lobby group, they should register as a foreign agent if they are advancing the interest of a foreign entity. So there's something called the Lobbying Disclosure Act. Lobbies are not 501c3. They cannot be. They are either 501c4, well, if they are nonprofits, or 501c6 if they are for-profit. So they have to report all of these things if they make any direct contact with government officials, if they intend to influence a specific legislation or policy, if they are lobbying for more than one contact. All of these, there are lots of other requirements by law, which once you have to register as a foreign agent, then you have to report to the government. No such requirements are there for a think tank. So think tanks usually are 501c3 think tanks. They do policy research and analysis, public education. They cannot advocate for any single individual or a party. They can do some lobbying, but it has to be in a very broader context. Like I said, that you can advocate that the United States invests more, say, in diplomacy than in weapons. You can say that the United States should focus more on renewable energies rather than fossil fuels, things like that, because it makes good sense. It will impact the budget, etc. But you can't get into far more specific policy making to the point that you become a lobbyist for any specific interest group. So these are the fundamental differences. And you can see that the traffic to shape America's national interest and American foreign policy is really, really very thick. Bumper to bumper traffic. There are thousands of think tanks, thousands and thousands of lobbyists and foreign agents and spies. And then you have media and reporters. And then you have cultural institutions and churches and religious groups. And then there are public interest groups also, which are seeking to impact US policy in general and US foreign policy in particular. So the good news is that if you're a student of foreign policy, there are many, many jobs that you can potentially look for, because there are so many institutions which are trying to make and shape US policy, and therefore they do need a lot of personnel. So thank you for watching. If you have not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, press the bell icon, share it with your socio-political network. If you're watching this video as part of a class, then make sure to read the accompanying article or articles or book chapters for this particular video. Take care. Thank you for watching.